Okay, so I'm Judy Clem. Welcome everybody on behalf of the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory. We are delighted to welcome you here tonight to our first lecture of 2021. This year, I want to mention the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory will be celebrating 35 years in our community. And just a quick bit of history, some of you probably are aware, but I just want to mention that it was back in the early 1970s when the Oak Park Conservatory had fallen into complete disrepair and was slated for demolition. And it was a group of concerned citizens who actually successfully banded together to raise funds to save it. And it was out of this group that inspired community leaders to form and incorporate the Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory in 1986. So we have a ton of things planned for this year in honor of our 35th anniversary. Today, we offer a wide range of programs such as tonight. We also offer volunteering, educational and recreational opportunities, tours, classes, something for everybody to enjoy year round. Please be sure to watch our website and mark your calendars for our upcoming programs on houseplants with Kent Gentry from the Conservatory doing that one. It will be fabulous. And we have a master gardener presenting on winter pruning, also coming up in February. So I was mentioning this earlier to you. The conservatory is now reopened to the public Tuesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And we will love to welcome you back during the winter months. There is a 25-person visitor limit at this time, and we just ask that everybody observes wearing face coverings while you're there. Also want to share the Valentine's Market is coming up beginning on February 1st through February 12th. Our greenhouses are full of beautiful blooming plants, succulent sample boxes and kits. And I'm super excited about, we have fresh floral arrangements made at the conservatory available to order, as well as heart-shaped bird feeders. So I'm super excited about that. Limited plants will be available for sale in person, but be sure to shop online at the conservatory website. So let me introduce Jill. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Jill Niewoner. Jill of Mama Grows left her full-time workforce job to raise children, chickens, and veggies in her small backyard in South Oak Park. She is an avid cheese maker, a mushroom grower, a soap maker, and a former PTO president at Longfellow School. She started the educational Longfellow Family Garden Club and ran it for many years. She has served on our board, the FOPCON board, and currently serves on the Sugar Beet Food Co-op board. She also served as a Cook County Extension Master Gardener. Jill began her love of gardening while picking blueberries on her uncle's farm outside Philadelphia. Eating those large sweet blueberries started a lifetime of growing her own food. Over the years, she has perfected and failed at many gardening projects. Her belief is that gardens are meant to be shared with other people and the animals that like to snack, but please don't get her started about the squirrels. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jill Niewoner, and we'll switch it over to your presentation. And please use the chat box for your questions, and Kayla will manage our Q&A towards the end.
Hi, everybody. So I'm so glad that everybody could be here today. I'm just going to minimize our faces so I can take us to our presentation. So this is kind of my philosophy about growing my own food. And please put in the chat if you're having any trouble hearing or seeing the presentation, and Judy can help you with that. Gardening is way cheaper than therapy. And of course you get delicious tomatoes, which is the whole reason I started gardening, was to get quality tomatoes. One of the things that's happening right now, I'm sure, is that all of you are getting all of the seed catalogs. And as Judy said, she likes to go in person and pick out her seeds, but obviously with COVID, sometimes that's not possible. And I have a really hard time saying no. So we're going to talk a little bit about when you get all these gorgeous seed catalogs, what you should do with them, how much you should buy, and then you're definitely going to buy too many and you're going to share with your friends. One thing to consider with quarantine is that a lot of the seed companies are very backed up. So this is a screenshot from Baker Creek Heirloom, which is rareseeds.com. They actually went on hold for a couple of weeks selling because they were so backed up with COVID orders. So there's definitely lots of seed companies out there. And I know that Baker Seed is back online. And not to plug anything, but I know that the Sugar Beet actually carries Baker's Creek seeds in the store. So let's talk a little bit about what to grow. So the most important thing when you're going through all those gorgeous catalogs is to find things that you like to eat. I always start with that. And then I think about the space because I figure I can always squeeze one more plant in. But I don't want to buy seeds for things that I'm not going to eat or my family's not going to enjoy. So a lot of the beginner veggies that are easy to grow are things like peas and greens and lettuce and kale, squash.
Where did you start?
Somebody asking a question? No, okay. One thing to keep in mind, there's a lot of garlic growers here in Oak Park in the area, River Forest. Garlic is always planted in the fall in our what do you call it? In our area. So if you want to plant garlic, that's fantastic, but make sure you read up on planting in the fall because you plant in the fall and harvest in about June. The other veggies that can be trickier, but are definitely doable around here: carrots, beets, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, nasturtium or edible flowers, and peppers. Peppers, you have to either buy plants or start them early under lights because they take a little bit longer to grow. And I don't recommend in our area corn because, believe it or not, in the Midwest, although corn grows well here, it needs a lot of space and it is wind pollinated. So in our smaller yards, there's not enough space for the corn to kind of pollinate itself. And mint, if you like mint, please do it in pots because you'll have it, your entire yard will be taken over by mint, as will your neighbors and probably everybody on the block at some point. This is some of the things that I've grown in the past. So because I don't have a lot of space, you see my mother-in-law on the left there, I've taken over her yard in Villa Park because she's got a huge yard. And so a lot of the things that I feel I don't have space for, I grow in her yard. Sweet potatoes are always fun. You see the kids at the Longfellow Garden, we took over the circle in the street and did pumpkins. I always grow potatoes. And the greens at the bottom there, that is arugula, which is definitely one of the easiest things to grow. Especially if you like it, you can grow it a lot. I grow it a lot because I like it. So let's talk about reading a seed packet. There are a lot of things to understand about the seed packet, and it's definitely worth your while to pay attention to what's on there. So we're going to talk about heirlooms in a minute, but one of the things it's going to tell you is if it's in an heirloom vegetable, it's going to tell you if it's frost sensitive, if it's a cool season vegetable or a warm season, and how many days it takes from transplanting to actually. It will tell you, and it tells you how to plant it. And that's the part that most people kind of ignore. They just throw their seeds however they feel. And that works, obviously, sometimes. But this will tell you how many days to expect before it emerges and you actually see some growth. It'll tell you how much seed spacing, so in between seeds. And then it always gives you row spacing. And that is really, in our area, it's really for farmers as far as I'm concerned, because we don't have 2 feet between rows most of the time to grow the things that we want. So I sort of use row spacing as a something to think about, but not necessarily always something I'm able to follow. And then thinning, we'll talk about thinning. especially with things like carrots and beets, where you get a lot of growth and you need to thin it so that you have space and energy from the plant to grow the root, which is the part that you eat. And then it'll tell you the maturity date. A lot of these seed packets have space to write down the date that you actually had sown the seeds. Some people keep a notebook. I actually do it on my phone. I have a little app, an Android app that's free that I use, which I have to look on my phone to tell you what it's called. It is called From Seed to Spoon in Android. I'm not sure if they have an Apple version, but there's lots of different apps like that. So I like to keep track of what I planted, when I planted it, so that I know what to expect. Because the worst thing is you think, oh, it didn't sow, and you plant something over it, and then you find. So one thing to keep in mind here in Chicago is the length of Chicago's growing season, which is the number of days between the last spring and the first autumn frost, 32 degrees, is between about 170 days and 200 days in the city where the buildings keep things warmer. We are kind of in between because we're so close to the city. But I like to use the 170-day rule just to kind of make sure I have success. And so on every seed packet, it's going to tell you how many days for this particular vegetable or fruit to grow. So in the case of the Swiss chard, it says 50 to 60 days. That's great because we have plenty of time for that to get itself established and grow. Watermelons, on the other hand, are typically, some of them are 110 days, some of them are 90 days. So you'll see that depending on if they were started as plants or if you start them as seeds, do you have enough time for it to grow before we have our first frost? And so that's always something to keep in mind when you're picking varieties. I tend to specifically look for varieties that have shorter seasons. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit. This is kind of a busy slide, but I'll just point out what's important. Seed packets are going to tell you everything you need to know about that particular vegetable. So things like when to harvest it. So this one is for a robin beet, and it tells me that the beets are going to be baby sized and they're going to only be 1 inch to 1.5 inches. So that helps me know, okay, I'm not waiting for a big, 5-inch beet. I'm going to get small beets. And so that's what I know. It tells me that the greens are edible. It tells me that it has high bolt resistance. And what that means is there are a lot of cool season vegetables that if it gets too hot, like in the 90s that it gets sometimes in our summer, it means that the vegetable plant will go to flower and then can become bitter. And that happens a lot with lettuces. And we'll talk a little bit about tricks to avoid that. Again, it talks about hardiness. The important thing here is when to sow outside or when to start indoors. So for things like beets and carrots, it's not recommended to start them indoors because when you transplant, it disturbs the root. But for things like watermelon, you definitely can start it indoor and then transplant it. I'm just gonna move on. All right, so let's talk about heirloom, hybrid, and GMO. Heirloom varieties means that they're open pollinated and you can save seeds from these varieties. These are varieties that have been around for years and years and years. They might be the same ones that your grandparents grew, maybe even in another country. And so if you save the seeds and plant it, it should be a true reproduction of the parent plant. They may be more prone to disease, but they're handed down from generation to generation. And there's all kinds of stories that go with them. So the Burpee website talks about the mortgage lifter tomato that came from a man who bred his own tomato plants so he could pay off his mortgage. So it's always fun to hear how these plants came to be. On the other hand, hybrid I'm just trying to move this over a little. Hybrid varieties, you can't save seeds. So these are bred to bring on the best qualities from multiple plants. So let's say a farmer has one tomato that never has any problems with pests, but it doesn't taste that good. And then they have another tomato that tastes delicious, but has all kinds of pest problems. They will breed those, pollinating one with the other until they come up with a tomato that has both all the good qualities, the flavor, the size, the uniform color, the yield, etc. Most of these are bred with disease resistance in mind. But you can't save those seeds, because if you try to plant hybrid seeds, you could get the original tomato or the other parent. You're not going to get the combination of both. That is not the same as GMO. GMO is where genes are inserted in a lab, and for the most part, corn, soybeans, cotton, squash, papaya, most of those are the ones that are, most of the seeds that you buy for growing in your garden, they don't even have varieties that are GMO, short of corn and soybeans. And most GMO seeds are used for growing animal feed. So that's something more to keep in mind when you're purchasing meat. It's a bigger deal than purchasing seeds for your garden. Okay, so organic or not, certified organic, Certified organic is a legal term defined by the USDA, and farmers must comply with the rules, including not using prohibited substances 3 years prior to harvest. But this does not mean that pesticides are not used. There are many, many, many pesticides that are cleared for use in organic farming. Non-organic is that the plants where the seeds to put in the little packets may have been grown with or your veggies from these seeds using organic practices. So in my case, I typically don't concern myself too much about which seeds I buy. If they have organic, I try, but I don't always. But I don't use any pesticides in my actual garden. So my plants are grown using organic practices. So let's talk a little bit about those of you that have some shade. Most vegetables require 6 to 8 hours of sun. These are 15 shade tolerant plants that can grow with a little bit of sun, with a little bit less sun. So maybe 4 hours a day, some even less. And the nice thing that they can be shaded by sun-loving crops. So let's say that you grow cucumbers up a trellis, but you want to grow some more arugula later in the summer. You can grow the arugula underneath a trellis of sun-loving plant, and the sun-loving plant will act as a shade for the shade-tolerant plant. Cilantro is a big one that people have a hard time with in this area. Cilantro needs shade. Cilantro does not like full sun. It will bolt and you'll never get any actual leaves. You'll get a lot of flowers. So cilantro is a really great thing to grow underneath your things like vining vegetables like squash or cucumbers and such. So let's talk about how to start seeds. So this is just a list of typical direct sow, meaning planting it directly in the garden, or starting indoors and buying plants. I won't go through the whole list. You can see it, but you definitely still want to look at your seed packet and read what they recommend for that particular seed, because there could be some that requires something different than most of them. But the easiest thing to grow, I would say, if you've never grown anything before, is radishes, greens, peas. Those are probably the fastest, beans, easiest things to grow. One thing that people have some trouble with is how to start their seeds. So you have to start your seeds, if you're starting your seeds indoors, in a proper seed starting mix. So it's much fluffier than regular soil, and it is typically, it has been pasteurized so that there's no soil-borne funguses or anything like that in the soil. And that allows you to know that you're growing, that your seedling has the best chance for starting. Obviously, that's a little bit different when you do it outside. It's going directly in soil, but one of the biggest mistakes that newbies make is bringing in soil from outside and trying to start their seeds. I don't honestly understand why you can start seeds outside and it's fine. And if you bring them in and try them in the soil from outside, it doesn't work. And maybe somebody else can tell me why that is, but I just know that definitely starting indoors, you want a proper seed starting mix. There's different ways to grow indoors. You can put things by the window. You can buy like those little arrow gardens, which are hydroponic. I have a setup similar to the shelving on the right. I just bought some plastic shelving and I have shop lights over them, and the lights are on chains so they can go up and down. The biggest thing that is difficult for people, things like tomatoes, are very difficult to start in a windowsill because they won't get enough light close enough, and then they grow really spindly. So you might be better off buying tomato plants if you don't have a good spot to grow them in a light close by. The next question we have is containers or raised beds, or directly in the ground. And so let's just talk about raised beds first. A lot of the soil around this area is lead contaminated. You can have your soil tested, which is why most people around here use raised beds. The things to keep in mind with a raised bed is you don't need, 3 feet of soil. It's very, it's okay to just, you can grow just about anything with 8 to 12 inch deep, an 8 to 12 inch deep bed. So soil can be very expensive, and also the bricks or wood or whatever you're going to buy can be also expensive. So keep that in mind, as you don't have to have a very deep bed to grow almost anything that you would want to here. For containers, almost any non-root vegetables can be grown in containers. So greens, spinach, beans, tomatoes, everything. Most people say you can't really do root vegetables, but if you see there, those are my onions in a little deck box, and the onions did just fine. I only fit about 6 of them in there, but I got beautiful onions, and that's only maybe, I don't know, maybe 6 inches deep. There's also a lot of new grow bags out on the market, and they're nice for tomatoes, potatoes, just about anything. There's special ones for potatoes that have holes in the bottom to harvest. And there's some that are a felted material that's supposed to prune the roots prune the roots, which gives the roots more air. I'm not really that particular. I've grown up in burlap bags. I've grown in fabric shopping bags. So the thing that you want to do before you start planting, obviously, is create a garden plan. And you can just do this with a piece of graph paper, but kind of sketch before you buy. There's a lot of things online, and there's a famous book about square foot gardening, which tells you in 1 square foot, how many cabbages can I plant and how many broccolis can I plant. Things like cabbage and broccoli and cauliflower take up a lot of space. they take a whole square foot to themselves. So if you're limited on space, you want to think about things that you can put many more in. So things like greens and things like beans, you'll have better luck maybe. Also, don't buy your plants too early. So we talked about the growing season here typically starts around Mother's Day. And that's when the FopCon sale is usually. And I would recommend not, if you're buying plants and not starting from seed, I would recommend not buying anything until Mother's Day, because you're going to have to harden them off and it will be too cold to do so earlier than that. Hardening plants off means taking the plants that have been grown in a greenhouse and putting them outside in a sheltered area so that they get used to being outside. Obviously, if something started outside, it doesn't have to acclimate. So here's some of my kids, my veggies. We made a donation from Oak Park Temple, the carrots over to the food pantry. This year on the left-hand side, if you see, this is a new bed that I grew specifically for shade tolerant plants. So this is on the north side of my house, between my house and my neighbors. And with their permission, I took up all the space. It was fun to garden with their 4-year-old. But if you notice, the reason I brought this up is this is a very nice and economical way to make a bed. These bricks are sold at the big box stores, and you literally just put down a brick and then the piece of wood fits into the next brick. And the nice thing is you can make these any size, any shape, you can turn a corner. But this is a nice economical way to utilize, to make your own raised bed. So this is actually, I have 8-foot length and they're 12 inches deep. You could go as low as 8 inches deep if you wanted. Let's talk about transplanting. So once you have your little sprouts, you're obviously going to have to transplant the seedlings either into a bigger cup if it's not ready to go outside, or outside. And one of the things about seedlings is at this stage on the left, there's often something called damping off. And that can happen if you're reusing potting soil to start your seeds. It's basically a wetness and a disease in the soil. So if you keep your seedlings too damp, too wet, which is where it gets the name damping off, or you're reusing your seed mixture, that can cause problems where you'll look at your seedlings one day and they look great, and the next day they're just done, they're gone. That's called damping off. So you want to be careful with that. And then if you notice, this is an example of a tomato that I planted. I'm not sure if it's actually my picture now that I'm looking at it, but I think it is. So tomatoes are interesting because they have, if you ever look at a tomato stem, it has little kind of hairs along the length of the stem. They actually have the ability, if it's an indeterminate plant, to grow new leaves and new tomatoes from that whole stem where the little hairs are. So what I like to do is if I'm buying tomato plants, or even if I'm starting with them from seed, if I start them from seed, I'm starting in about February. If I buy them in May, which is still a little bit cool around here sometimes to plant them. So I harden them off by laying them sideways in the pots in my backyard. And what that does is allow, for a couple days, the plant will start to raise up to face the sun. And I do that so I can plant them laying down like this and cover the entire stem with soil. And then the leaves kind of raise up so that I don't break it when I try to lay it sideways and plant it. This allows for my tomatoes to become really, really lush, and they get a better start because they're getting roots all along that stem area. Okay. So the next question everybody wants to know is, when do I plant my seeds? So we talked a little bit, most vegetables have to have 6 to 8 hours of sunlight a day. Cool weather crops can usually be planted as soon as the ground can be worked. There are definitely some things that can grow in the winter with a covering. So a lot of greens, spinach. I mean, I've seen spinach come up in the snow. Things like peas have to be started much, much, much earlier than you would expect. So, I mean, the second that the ground could be worked, you want to put your peas in if you want snap peas or shelling peas, because they're going to be done by the time, you know, end of May, June comes around, they're already done. And I like to follow the USDA plant hardiness map, which tells us that we are in zone 6A or B, depending on how close we are to the city. And typically when you buy plants or seeds, it will tell you these are good for zone whatever. Warm crops are, like I said, have to go in after Mother's Day. But the cool crops, the nice thing is you can plant them early and then plant them again at the end of June or July, and you'll have a harvest in the fall. This might be a little bit hard to see, but I put it up here because you can download these everywhere. So just about every seed company has their own planting list. So things like, if you look at the one on the right, because I think it's a little bit easier to read, I'll make it bigger. The green says start it indoors. The yellow says it's time to either plant seeds or transplant, and the red is when you harvest. So this is for our area, and it will tell you start your seeds at the beginning of March for broccoli, and you'll be harvesting in June. For carrots, you'll notice there's two times. So you can plant them in the end of March or April to harvest in June, and then you can plant them again in August and harvest in October. Same thing with kales and lettuces and peas. So this allows you, if you don't have a lot of space, to still reap a lot of vegetables, because you can plant multiple times. Again, keep in mind, I always plant peas again in kind of June or July, but I just have them shaded by something like cucumbers, because cucumbers like a lot of sun and peas need it to be a little shadier. So companion planting is basically a theory that talks about what plants do well together. And there's a wonderful book called, what's it called? It is called Carrots Love Tomatoes. And I love that book. My Carrots Love Tomatoes book is filthy because I take it out in the garden with me and it's covered in soil. But things like smelly herbs, garlic, onions, if you plant those near cabbage or brassicas, which are broccoli, cauliflower, it will keep some of the cabbage worms away and flies away. Tomatoes and brassicas, they say, repel each other. So neither one will grow very well if they're next to each other. Tomatoes protect asparagus from asparagus beetles. They say to plant radishes with your squash and cucumbers to protect against insects. There's all kinds of things you can read about this online and in books. But companion planting is kind of a known thing. Things like borage is supposed to be really good to plant amongst strawberries. The most important thing, if you're not going to use pesticides in your garden, is plant crop rotation. So even though we don't have, or I don't have a lot of space, I still don't plant, for instance, my tomatoes in the same place every year, because so tomatoes, eggplants, potatoes are all in the same family. So I don't want to plant any of those in the same spot that I had my tomatoes last year, because that means they could potentially get disease that's overwintered in the soil. So you have to kind of know the different categories of plants and the families, and know, not to plant them in the same spot. I try to rotate things around, even if it's just in a small bed. I might put things at the other end of the bed this year than I did last year. And I always like to intermingle herbs all over the place, and onions, I like to pop in everywhere to kind of help with the pest control. So let's talk about really small spaces, like a porch. Like I said, you can grow almost anything in a pot or a grow box. There's lots of them out on the market, but there's no reason you can't just, take a coffee can and grow a tomato. The only thing you have to be careful of is drainage, so that you don't have roots sitting in too much water. There are self-irrigated pots, which have kind of a false bottom, and that allows you to keep it full with water, but the plant isn't sitting in the water. It's also a good thing to create vertical spaces. So if you can see on the left, that's I think that's a cantaloupe, and it's growing in a pot with a trellis. And then on the right is I've got a trellis against the side of my house, and that is a butternut squash growing up there. And then obviously sunflowers are fun because they grow so tall, and you can always intermingle them with peas, cucumbers, pole beans will grow up the sunflower, which is a lot of fun. These are also some other photos from my garden. So make use of existing objects. These are my grapes, and I've taken over my neighbor's wrought iron fence with her permission, because I share everything I grow. And so they're doing great. I didn't have to build anything. I didn't have to buy anything. They're just hanging out on her fence. This other picture of the pumpkin is actually not mine. It's my neighbor's. And they grow kind of over the fence all the time into the alley side. And typically, as soon as that pumpkin starts to get a little bit orange, they will put basically a chicken wire fence on it so the squirrels don't get it. They put a chicken wire box kind of around it. But they've been doing great growing pumpkins, right into the alley, which is a lot of fun for the kids. We talk about fruits. So these are some of my kids and some friends. So I typically grow raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, and strawberries. Strawberries are definitely easy to grow in our area. There's day neutral, everbearing versus June bearing. June bearing will all come, they'll all be ripe at the same time in about June. Everbearing will continue to grow strawberries throughout the summer, some into the fall. If you see the top right picture with my niece there and her friend, raspberries are very easy to grow, but they will take over. So I planted a bunch of raspberries along the fence between myself and my neighbor, and now she's got a bunch of raspberries on the other side of the fence, which again, she's happy to have, but you should know that they will take over. Blackberries are also very simple, but they will spread. Apples require cross-pollination. So if you don't have room for 2 trees, you can get a grafted tree with multiple varieties. But actually, there's enough apples around this area that they should be cross-pollinated with just other trees that are in the area. Blueberries are not easy to grow in our area. They require acidic soil, which means you either need to keep them in a big pot, or you need to manage your soil and manage the pH of your soil, because our soil is about 6.5 to 7 pH, and blueberries require about 5 to 6, 4.5 even. So something to keep in mind, if you haven't had good luck with blueberries, I would recommend doing them in a pot and giving them some sulfur to keep those going. And also blueberries require cross pollination. So typically they say three plants at a time. There are some grapes require a trellis. There are some new hardy breeds, like there's supposedly hardy kiwis that I planted last year, but I've not gotten fruit yet. We'll see what happens. There's a Chicago hardy fig, which I know last year FopCon sold at the plant sale. And if you have space, it's always nice to have stone fruits. Peach trees do well in this area. I've got an apricot tree that I planted maybe 2 years ago. So I should be getting fruit this year, unless the squirrels get it, but that's another story. Success is not always what you see. So keep that in mind. You might think that you have a failure and you actually don't. And I know Judy started us off by talking a little bit about my uncle and his farm. This is me in the 70s up on the left. And then a few years ago now at his farm picking blueberries with my daughter, which is what got me started on all this in the first place.
Wonderful.
And that's it.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was a lot of information, and we really appreciate you covering so many different aspects of it. And Kayla Chase from our Friends of the Oak Park Conservatory Board is going to pull together the questions. Kayla, are you ready to pepper Jill with some of our questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So kind of starting off with just a few questions about damping off. So I know that you covered a little bit what causes it, but maybe we can dive back into that because I know I also have that issue in growing from seeds. And so how do you prevent it? Kind of focusing a bit more on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest prevention is to use sterilized seed starting mix and not reuse seed starting mix from year to year. And then making sure that you're not keeping things too wet. So, you know, the seed starting mix should be damp, but not soaked. And that's really all you have to do. It can also be from a little bit of lack of light because the light will help dry it out a little bit. The other thing I always recommend, whether you're watering outside or inside, is water the soil, not the plant. So, you know, you don't want to ever drench it, but I also don't recommend watering from above because, excuse me, that can cause some other problems with fungus and disease, especially outside. When you're outside, when I teach the kids at the school garden, I always teach them aim the hose at the soil, not at the plants. And definitely it's best to water early in the morning so that it has all day to dry off if you do get some on the leaves. That's about it.
So kind of building on what you were saying about making sure that there's light, there was a bunch of questions, especially if you're starting seeds early, is do you have any recommendations for grow lights, where to get them, the best type, just kind of any insight around that?
Yeah, you can I use regular old shop lights, like the old fashioned shop lights. You can buy specialty bulbs at almost any big box store. Wanamaker's in Downers Grove is a beautiful place to go get stuff, and they have, I'm sure, bulbs. Definitely the big box stores. You don't need full spectrum lights, which are much more expensive because you're not growing indoor permanently. Full spectrum are typically used for indoor growers. You just need, I mean, some people just put a regular fluorescent light to get their seeds started, and that works fine. I do use a grow light that's not full spectrum. And we built our own shelves. It was very economical. We bought plastic, you know, the 5-tier plastic stackable 4-foot things, and we screwed in shop lights to each shelf. Back to damping off, the other thing is that seedlings can get cold. So if you're growing indoors, like in your basement, I would definitely recommend a heat mat. And those can be purchased online or at any big box store. Wanamaker's has them definitely. I get a lot of stuff at Wanamaker's because I like them. But I'm sure a lot of other local places have it as well. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. I also buy just as an aside, I bought grow lamps on Amazon. So not to support giant Amazon.
Yeah, I mean,
but
definitely you can get them online. There's also, I just found out about this place from Lissa Dysart. I don't know if she's on here. But there's this place called Greenhouse Megastore. And it is half the price of the big box stores. It's basically it's probably like a wholesale place for a lot of the farms. But they've got all kinds of cool stuff. And I got a lot of my seed starting stuff there this year, just because I wanted to check it out.
awesome. So speaking of starting seeds,
Sorry,
know-
what was it called?
I think it's called Greenhouse Megastore. Let me look, hold on. I'll answer a question while I look it up on my phone.
yes, there's a comment that it was also, Kelly also has bought from Greenhouse Megastore as well. So
Yes, from Lissa Dysart.
yes, Greenhouse Megastore. So another question is, let's say you have seeds from previous years. Can you, if you have them left over, maybe you got them as a friend, how long can you plant them? How long are they good for?
So that's a good question. Every seed is different. They will always, on a seed packet, it will always tell you what year it was packed for and what the expected rate of sprouting will be. Most seeds will last a few years, especially if kept in a cool, dry place. Things like onions typically won't sprout after the first year that they're packed. Most other seeds will, but the best way to find out is to take, 5 or 6 or a handful and put them in a damp paper towel for a couple days, and then count how many sprout and how many don't. That gives you your percentage. So then, if you've got 30 seeds, you expect, 15 of them to sprout. I've planted seeds with the kids in the gardens that are, 5 years old, and they're fine, but it really depends on the seed type and where they've been stored. I just saw something pop up about determinant versus indeterminate.
Yeah, for tomatoes.
You want me to talk about that?
Sure.
So determinant versus indeterminate. Determinant means just like it sounds. There's an end point. The plant will grow to be 4 feet tall, and all of the tomatoes will be there in August, and then it's done. Indeterminate means that the plant will grow indefinitely, and it will just keep getting taller and taller and taller until it doesn't have the right conditions anymore. There's no sun, it gets cold, whatever. Indeterminate tomatoes definitely need to be pruned if you want to get good fruit. Otherwise, you'll just end up with crazy leaves everywhere and not a lot of fruit, mostly because the plant's giving all its energy to leaf creation and it's not getting enough sunlight because the leaves are so lush to grow good fruit. Determinant, on the other hand, you typically don't have to prune and typically take up less space. So I'm actually trying out some hydroponics this year, and I'm growing some determinant tomatoes in mason jars using hydroponic techniques. So we'll see what happens, but definitely determinant tomatoes are better for pots. You can put them in the garden too, it won't hurt them, but they're going to be shorter than your other tomatoes, so they might get crowded out by the indeterminate varieties.
Perfect. So when you take your plants then outside and you plant them outside, what are some great ways to stop animals from eating your plants without pesticides?
There are none. I have given up that fight. My theory is the garden is there for everyone, and if somebody stops by, a neighbor stops by and picks something, they're more than welcome to it. And if a animal stops by to pick something, they're welcome to it too. I have chickens, so I do put a little bit of a physical fence, like chicken wire, around so that my chickens don't eat everything. I have not found anything that will deter squirrels. I've tried. I've thought of everything I could possibly do. I've done everything. There is nothing to deter the squirrels in Oak Park, and there's nothing sadder than watching a squirrel take a bite of your beautiful tomatoes the minute they are ripe and taking one bite and throwing it away. So the only thing I can tell you for that is I will bring my tomatoes in before they're ripe. So instead of letting them ripen on the vine, if they're hard, they're never going to ripen. But once they have a little bit of give and are a little bit, not mushy, but kind of give you some give, they can be brought in and put in a paper bag, and they will ripen and taste just as delicious. Maybe not just as delicious, but good enough without the squirrel bites. Yeah, there's not a lot of, I can't help you with that because I can't help myself with that.
What about thinking about grubs that get on, the pumpkin vines, those kind of, do you have a way to kind of navigate around those?
Yeah,
Judy's like,
so depending on what it is. So there's some things that are actually in the soil year after year and can overwinter. And so the best way to manage that, like I said, is not to plant your pumpkin in the same spot every year. There's definitely snails and grubs and so forth that get into my strawberry patch every year. And believe it or not, I put out shallow pans of beer and they fall into the beer and drown. They must like beer a lot. I don't use Kinslager beer though, because my husband would not be happy with that. I have used cheap beer. And so other kinds of grubs, I mean, there's certain beetles that the only thing you can do is pick them off with your fingers. A lot of things like aphids will just take a heavy stream of water. You can spray right at them and they'll be gone. So there's a lot of different techniques. It really depends on the plant you're talking about and the kind of insect. As a master gardener, I'm sure you can call up the conservatory and Kayla will be answering master gardener questions at some point. And you have to look up what the specific plant is and what the specific insect is.
I have firsthand experience with picking off Japanese beetles off of our congregation's community garden all last summer for about 10 days. And I just flung them into a soapy bucket of water and they just fell off, and you just had to be diligent. I was going there every single day until I got the last one. And it was so frustrating, but I won.
Yay.
So speaking of kind of like you were saying, some stuff's in the soil. I know you touched briefly on crop rotation and, not planting things in the same place always. Can you speak a little bit more about that? How far distance? Are you talking separate beds? Are you talking right next to each other? Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yes. If you're a farmer, you're going to plant corn here this year, soybeans here this year, and next year you're going to switch them. Obviously, we don't have that luxury. I don't typically worry too much about it, especially if I haven't had problems. But I try, if in an 8-foot bed, if I had tomatoes at this end and broccoli at this end, next year I just switch them. I mean, I don't get too picky about how many inches apart it is and that sort of thing, because I just don't have the space to do that. And there have been times where, for whatever reason, I had so many extra tomato plants and the only place to put them was where I had them last year. I put them where I had them last year, or I put them in a pot next to the bed. But yeah, I don't think you have to get too picky about it because you're not growing commercially. But it's kind of a guidance, not a hard, fast rule. Definitely if you had a real problem like verticulum wilt or something in your vining plants, which is caused by an insect getting into the stem that comes from the soil, getting into the stem while the plant is very young. And one good way to avoid that is to plant them later so that they're not in the cold soil, or transplant them later. So grow them inside and don't put them out to the soil till later. But if you had that problem and all your pumpkins died last year or all your cucumbers died last year, I would definitely not plant them. I'd plant them as far apart as you could, I guess, say it that way.
Perfect. And so when it comes to soil, how important is it, or how worrisome is it if there's lead in the soil? Are we needing constant, do we need to check the soil before we're planting? Is it, a big concern?
Yeah, I guess I'm less concerned about it now that my kids are older, but I probably should be more concerned about it. When my kids were younger, I didn't plant anything directly in the ground because I was worried about lead content. You can get a lead test at any big box store, where you take a sample and you send it in. Obviously, lead is a problem for kids. I don't know enough about the medical issues related to eating food grown in lead-laden soil. That would be something that is beyond my pay grade. So, what I would definitely do is, if you're concerned, I would do the lead test and find out, how bad it is, and definitely use raised beds if you have to. I can tell you that if you have young kids, and they're playing outside, it's just as bad as if you're growing in it. So, or maybe even more so. So it's willing to talk, it's worth talking. It's worth getting it tested and talking to your doctor about it.
Perfect. And then I know you had brought up berries a bit. You had talked about blueberries. Is there any, how many seasons generally does it take to get fruit from some berries?
Yeah, it depends on the fruit. Strawberries can be the first. Strawberries, you don't want to start from seed because you'll be waiting for 20 years, maybe, maybe not 20, but a lot. Strawberries, if you buy plants, you could get strawberries the first year. Blueberries typically take about 3 years before they start producing. But if you've seen, like, outside of Whole Foods in River Forest, every year they've put out all kinds of berry plants that are already producing. So they're already over 3 years. You could buy one like that and get berries the first year. It really depends how big the plant is when you buy it. When I first started doing blueberries, you couldn't get them everywhere. I actually went to a farm in Indiana and convinced a blueberry farmer who does U-pick to let me dig up 3 of his blueberries because I wanted them so badly and I wanted big ones. So yeah, I mean, you can buy them now that they're well over 3 years.
Awesome. And there's 2 more questions about tomatoes. One is, can you explain the technique around planting tomatoes sideways? And then do you have any tips for blossom end rot on the tomatoes?
Yeah. Okay. Let me think. So planting them sideways, you could kind of see in the picture. Like I said, if you lay them sideways, let's pretend this is my plant. If I lay them sideways, here's my cup and here's my stem and here's the leaves. If I lay them out sideways for a couple days, the leaves will start tilting up toward the sun. And the benefit of that is if I tried to plant this sideways and pull this up, I might break it right here. So if you let it grow up for about 2 or 3 days, it'll lean itself towards the sun. Then you just cover this whole thing with soil and this little piece is sticking up out of the soil. And again, the benefit of that, whoops, I almost dropped that. The benefit of that is that it's going to grow roots all along that stem. Everywhere those hairs are will grow roots. So that's going to give your tomato a much more solid base and a better, it's going to get more nutrients. It's always better to have a good root system because that's where the plant gets, gets all of its nutrients. Okay, so blossom end rot, the bane of all of our existence. One thing is once it's got blossom end rot, it's not going to get better. So you can't try to save it. Just get rid of all the bad ones. Sometimes people add calcium. Sometimes it's telling you there's a nutrient issue in the soil. It can also be caused by inconsistent watering. And I don't know, Kayla, if you agree with me, if there's any other tricks that you know as a master gardener, but most of the time I feel like it has to do with inconsistent watering. And once, either there's a kind of drought and then it starts raining really heavily or vice versa. But you definitely want to pick all the blossom end rot tomatoes and even maybe the stems that they're attached to. Do you agree with that?
I do.
Okay. I want to make sure I haven't encountered blossom end rot in a while, luckily.
Awesome. Well, the last question I have for is Judy. And there was a bunch of questions is, will this lecture be shared? Will the slides be shared? And so I figured I'd leave that to you.
Yeah, that's great. Well, so first of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Jill, this was just fantastic. The information was just so useful and practical and is getting us all excited for wanting to start seeds and getting ready for planting our gardens. And so thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. I do want to remind you the conservatory is open and we do have a Valentine's Day plant sale coming up. I will be sending out a follow-up email shortly with a little survey so we could ask you guys for some feedback, and I'll include information about the Valentine's plant sale and our upcoming programs on winter pruning, which is when you're supposed to prune your bushes and your shrubs, and house plants, which will be fantastic. So be sure to join. It'll be a Zoom format, virtual, free. So be sure to participate. This program tonight was recorded, and so we will share this with the full list of attendees, and it'll be up on our website as well. So by all means, we want to get the information out to you. So at this time, there's still a bunch of us on here. You're welcome to unmute if you want to say hi or just ask any other questions. We're just so delighted that you all stuck with us, and it's great to see you, and we miss you.
Yeah, I see there's a lot more questions. So I don't know, Kayla, if you want to send them to me, I could try to answer them and we could put it up with at the end of the slideshow or something.
Absolutely.
Well, you have string of heart vines at the Valentine's sale. I will need to check on that from what Patty's got planned for the sale, because I don't know that plant list. Adding supplemental lime, Espoma brand, for example.
Yeah, I've
Helps
never,
against blossom end rot.
yeah, lime is actually
ale.
helpful to bring your pH level up in your garden.
Okay.
And I've never had to use that here. I've never tried that on blossom end rot, but it might make sense.
One of the questions I had that was sent to me directly was, are there any vegetables that should not be planted near strawberries?
Not that I can think of. Peas are good near strawberries. Beets. I can't think of anything that shouldn't be.
My strawberries just take over, so I think it's more of where I plant them. They're more like a ground cover, which is fine with me. I got some new berry shrubs from the West Cook Wild Ones plant sale last fall that I put in. So I'm excited to see. I've got not chokeberry. What is it? I do have chokeberry, but
Serviceberry?
I do have serviceberry as well. I have like a whole berry section along my the south facing part of my garden. So
Nice.
why can't I think of what they are? I put in two different gooseberries,
Currants.
currants, two black currants, And
Cycle through them all.
not gooseberries, but something like that. Elderberry. Do you
Oh,
have
nice.
elderberry, Jill?
I don't, because those get big like a tree,
I
right?
have a big spot. I have like a 6-foot space. So
I don't have a spot for that. I do
Yeah.
have black currants that got so big they took out my rhubarb.
oh,
It got so huge it shaded my rhubarb completely.
and are you able to harvest your currants?
Oh yeah.
I'm excited to make some currant jam or
Yeah, I mostly let the chickens eat them because
okay.
my family doesn't like them.
They're delicious.
Judy, are your berries in the ground or in some pots?
Um, I have blueberries and service berries and these other berries we just talked about, and my strawberries are all on the ground on the south part of our property. So, yeah, and the blueberry I just moved. I have I think I have 2 different types of the blueberries. So
Nice.
I have to amend the soil and cross my fingers and we'll see if they do well.
So speaking of amending the soil, another question was about adding coffee grounds.
I do that a lot.
So what is that? How is that helping the soil? What is that doing?
So coffee grounds actually lower the pH of the soil, make it more acidic.
Okay.
So things like blueberries, it can't hurt to add that. Things like strawberries can handle a little bit of more acidic soil.
Okay.
I don't have any real data on does it actually really do anything else, but it does lower the pH.